to the Gospel of Matthew chapter 2. We concluded chapter 1 last week. And at the beginning of Matthew chapter 2, we have this story about the visit of the wise men. Now, some general details about this story should be very familiar to anyone who's been in church for any amount of time, or to anyone that has some familiarity with how Christmas is traditionally celebrated, because that's usually when you would hear this story preached on, or this story would come to your recollection. But what is really fascinating about this story, in the context of the theme that we are looking at, which is king and kingdom, is that this story is not really about these wise men. But rather, Matthew is telling a story that presents two kings before us. It's really a story about two kings. And this is important because our sermon series is called King and Kingdom, and not what? Kings and Kingdom. So maybe we're being presented with these two kings so that a comparison and a choice can be made. So first, let's consider the first time the word king is mentioned in Matthew's gospel. When is the first time the word king is mentioned? Well, it's back in chapter 1 verse 6, in the genealogy, where it refers to David as the king. We've already talked about why this is important, because Matthew is establishing that Jesus is in the line of King David. But that was in the genealogy. That's not really part of the narrative, the story. That was in the introduction. The story begins in chapter 1, verse 18, describing what? The circumstances of the birth of Christ. And after the story begins, after the narrative begins, the first time the word king is used is where? It's in Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. And who is the first king presented in this story? It must be Jesus, right? It must be the newborn king, Christ, the Messiah, right? What does it say in chapter 2, verse 1? Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king. What? It's not Jesus. Jesus isn't the first king that's presented. It's Herod. And Matthew is intentional here in presenting him as a king. In verse 3, he's referred to again as Herod, what? The king. In verse 9, it says that the wise men were listening to the king. In verse 4, at the drop of a hat, he can summon who? All the chief priests and the scribes of the Jews. So as I said, the story is really a story about two kings, the first of which is Herod. So I think some background and understanding who Herod is could be helpful. Herod was given control of the region of Judea, the land of the Jews, by the Romans in around 40 BC. So he was considered as the one who ruled over them, what? The king of the Jews. By all accounts, this guy was a vicious, bloodthirsty tyrant. Whenever he suspected anyone, even a suspicion of anyone plotting to take over his rule, what would he do? Have them killed. He went as far as murdering his own wives and sons when he did not trust them. There was a particularly egregious anecdote from the end of his life that I saw. As he lay dying, think about this. As he lay dying, he arranged for all the notable men of Jerusalem to be assembled together and killed as soon as his own death was announced. Why? So that the people might weep instead of rejoice on the day of his death. Think about it. Some king. But I said it's a story about two kings, right? There's a second king that's presented in the passage. In verse 2, the wise men are looking for someone born as who? The King of the Jews. They were alerted to him because of a sign they saw in the heavens, a particular star. And in verse 3, they just don't call it a star. What do they call it? His star. His star. In verse 6, we see a quotation from the Old Testament, Micah chapter 5, verse 2, which says what? A ruler. A ruler will come out of Bethlehem. A ruler. And when the wise men find Jesus, what do? How do they respond? They fall down and they worship him. We already talked about that in the context of worship and what that means, right? To prostrate ourselves, to have that posture. When the wise men come, what do? They fall down and they worship him. So we see the second king that is presented is who? It is Jesus. And what Matthew has done is he has painted a contrast, a comparison. And he has left us with a choice to make. Who is the king? Who do you want? Who do you want? Do you want a madman? Or do you want the Messiah? Do you want someone who takes the lives of others, or someone who lays down his life for the life of others? Do you want a wolf, or do you want a shepherd king? Like it says in verse 6, who will do what? Shepherd the people. Do you want to put your trust, your allegiance, and worship in the false and flawed leaders and influencers of today? Or do you want to put your trust in King Jesus? There's a contrast. It's presented for us. Two kings. You've got Herod, the Roman appointed king of the Jews. And then you have who? Jesus, the God-appointed king of all kings. Yet as we come to that second king, Jesus, and our relationship to him, we have some choices. So you got two kings, and now when it comes to Jesus, you've got some choices. There's three choices that I want to take some time to look at today, that we can see here in this passage. How do we respond to this king? We can respond with indifference. We can respond with hostility. Or we can respond, as we saw, with worship. So first, we can choose indifference. And this is the choice that's made by the Jewish religious leaders. What happens? The wise men, they come to town and they say, what do they say basically? In effect, they say, where is he? Where is the child who is the Christ? Herod gets wind of their question, and in his jealousy, he's troubled. And he will gladly accept the title King of the Jews, right? He would gladly accept that. But his knowledge of the Hebrew Bible, not so great. So what does he do? He calls on the experts. Who does he bring in? The chief priests and the scribes. The scribes, or the teachers of the law, they knew their stuff. What did the scribes do? They spent all day meticulously copying the Holy Scriptures, word by word, line by line. These were professional scholars, professional Bible scholars, Bible teachers. They didn't need to open up Micah to know in which town the Messiah would be born. It's not as though that question came and they had to run to the scrolls. It's not surprising that they knew the answer, that it would be Bethlehem. It would have been shame on them if they didn't. But what is surprising is they did nothing with the answer. They did nothing with it. Unlike the wise men, who are from the east, so they're foreigners, they're Gentiles, they've traveled this considerable distance. These scribes, they know the answer, but have no interest in pursuing it, no interest in going after it. They weren't even curious. Could this be the one that the Scriptures testify of? They were indifferent. And sadly, there are so many who would call themselves Christians but live their lives in a way that has no tangible connection to the idea that Jesus is King. They're indifferent. And what I'm talking about is not the world. Sure, there are people in the world who are indifferent to Jesus. They know the story. They know he's born in Bethlehem. They know his mother's name was Mary. They know that he did miracles. He died on the cross. He rose from the dead. They know all about this. They just don't care. There are lots of people in the world like that. But functionally, there are also lots of people like that in the church, living in apathetic indifference. What should we do? Should we start running out there right now? Maybe we should examine our own hearts. Let's start there. Do we fill a pew on Sunday, but functionally live a life that has no connection to who Jesus is? We can choose indifference, as the scribes and chief priests and basically all of Jerusalem did. Secondly, we could choose hostility, as Herod did. In verse 3, when Herod hears this news about this potential newborn king, what does it say? It says that he is troubled. Troubled. Now, when we read that, that might come off as an understatement to us, because the word in the original Greek is from the verb tarasso, which literally means to stir up, to disturb, to be shaken. So when you read that Herod is troubled, the picture is not, this is a perplexing event. I'm troubled. Herod is in deep crisis. Shaken to the core. He's terrified, but we have to ask the question, why? Why? Because he views this as a threat. He views this as a threat. A threat to what? To his own power, right? A threat to what? His own control. A threat to what? His way of thinking. A threat to what? More importantly, his way of living. And King Jesus is such a threat. And when you think about it, Jesus is a real threat to anyone and everyone who thinks seriously about him. For this simple reason, if I were to make it as simple as possible, if Jesus is king, what does that mean? It means you are not. It's about as simple as we can make it. If Jesus is king, it means your dethronement. It means your submission. It means you can't lead your life any longer, as Herod did, by your own misguided desires. This story comes up all the time in Christmas as a cute, I feel like it sometimes comes off as a cute Christmas story. It's really not what this is. This is a story about a nasty conflict of kingdoms. Right? That's really what this story is about if you get underneath. This is a conflict of kingdoms. One kingdom in which everyone is their own king. And another in which Jesus is the only king. So here's that truth again. Here's that truth again. That's as simple as we can make it. And something for us to reflect on, right? Something for us to take and chew on and digest. If he is king, then you and I are not. So we can respond to Jesus with indifference. We can respond to him with hostility. Both equally actually reject him. Both do. Or we can respond to him with worship. We can respond to him with worship as these wise men do. Now, let's take a moment now to, give these wise men some context. First, what don't we know about them? Right? We'll start there. We don't know how many there were. So the popular notion is that there were 3. Right? There are songs Christmas carols and songs, like We Three Kings, right? You may have heard that. But that notion of there being 3 wise men just comes from the fact that there were 3 types of presents or gifts that were presented. But it doesn't say there were 3. So we don't know how many. Could have been 2. Could have been 50. We don't know. It says they come from where? The east. So we don't know exactly where, right? It could have been Babylon, right? It could have been Persia. But what we know is that they were Gentiles, right? Not Jewish people. When did they come? They have historically been portrayed as arriving on the night of Jesus' birth, right? Along with the shepherds who receive the announcement from the angels. But if you look at the context in Matthew, right, and you look at the information we have in the story, most likely they came months, possibly even over a year after Jesus' birth. They were most likely men of influence and means. How do we know that? Well, we can deduce that from this long journey they took, right? You need some coin to pull that off. And we can judge that from what? The extravagant gifts that they bring. So there are some things that we know about these wise men. There are other things that we don't know, but one thing is sure. One thing is clear from this passage, and that is what? That what their response to Jesus is. They worship him. They worship him. I mean, when you read it in the full context of what has come before, right? This long journey, this persistence in trying to find this child, it's really kind of quite remarkable when you think about it. But what makes it great, what makes this great is not merely what they did. What makes it great is who did what. Who worships the King of the Jews? Does Herod, the earthly king of the Jews, worship Jesus? No. How about the Jewish scribes and chief priests? Do they worship Jesus? No. How about all the other Jews in Jerusalem? Do they worship Jesus? No. But how about the Gentiles, the outsiders, who are not from the promised land? Do they bow down in homage? Yes. They do. What is Matthew doing here? Right? That's a question we got to ask. What is Matthew doing with this fact? What is the importance of who received Jesus in this story? Well, with the wise men, Matthew is echoing what the angel of the Lord said to the shepherds in Luke chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. What did the angel say? Fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. The kingdom of heaven. We'll wrap up in a second here and have an opportunity to respond in worship. The kingdom of heaven, the gospel of Jesus Christ, breaks through all manner of boundaries. To the Jew and Gentile, to the rich and poor, to the seemingly righteous and the knowingly unrighteous. And this scene so perfectly depicts the good news of the gospel of the kingdom. This good news is for all people, even the seemingly least likely candidates for God's love. We will see in Scripture, and I know this from watching the gospel at work, that this good news, it will draw a mix, a hodgepodge of fallen humanity. Samaritan adulterers, immoral prostitutes, greedy tax collectors, despised Roman soldiers, ostracized lepers, all the unlikely ones. Even me. Son of immigrants from halfway around the world. Even you. The son or daughter of whoever and from wherever you are from. The grasp of the King of the kingdom of heaven can reach even you, even now. It's interesting when you see the gifts that these wise men bring. They bring gold, they bring frankincense, they bring myrrh. Myrrh is interesting. It's a perfume, it's used for, it has many purposes. one of the purposes it's used for is in the anointing of a body upon burial. And one of the next times we will see myrrh presented in the gospel narrative of the story is when Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea are preparing Jesus' body. What do they use to prepare the body? Myrrh. So even here at the beginning, even here at the very beginning of the story, what are we reminded? That Jesus was born, but he was born to a purpose. He was born to what? To die. To save people from sins. Right in the beginning, we have a clear reminder to us of that. And we heard in the call to worship this morning that Jesus, before he goes to the cross, he goes on trial before Pontius Pilate. Who is he? A leader, right? A governor. Someone of authority. Someone who men had, looked to as an authority. And what does Pontius Pilate ask him? He asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" What a question. Are you the king of the Jews? And we read what Jesus said. My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not from this world. And Pilate said to him, so you are a king? Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. For this purpose I was, what? Born. Jesus says. And for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. We have a choice today. Who is the King of the Jews? Who is your King? Whose voice are you going to listen to? Will you be indifferent to Jesus? Will you be hostile to Jesus? Or will you bow low? With whatever gifts you have, in hand, and adoringly worship him. Hear me this morning. You have that chance right now to worship the King. You have that chance. We have that chance right now to worship the King. To lift up our voices as those who listen to his voice. So now, let us respond to Jesus. Let us respond to Jesus and worship the King.